Hardcore Henry, an action-packed thrill ride of a film for everyone to enjoy, or a style over substance piece with little more than flashy visuals to it. Both of these claims have been made in numbers since this movie was released, but which of them holds true? Well, let's take a look, shall we? As a heads up, I'll be limited to stills in this video, as the copyright bots will immediately aggro otherwise. Apologies if this irritates you, but this is a matter that can't be helped. The film begins by showing us a trio of youths with unsavory expressions on their faces, with their probable leader tossing a toy in one hand before hurling it at a wall, shattering it. A man then arrives and chases them off, and the perspective of the camera has shifted. Its position close to the ground is meant to be a perspective shot from another character, which is something that this movie does that few even attempt. Hardcore Henry is entirely in the first-person perspective of Henry. It never shows him from the usual third-person perspective. This is point of view, which most people don't seem to understand the definition of. Seriously, people slap that term on so many things that have nothing to do with perspective. Anyway, the man then turns to face the character whose eyes we're seeing through before calling him something that I can't quote without this site getting very, very angry. Given his direct nature of speaking to this individual, it's probable that he knows who this is. We'll get back to that towards the end. The opening credits then roll, and after their conclusion, we are then in the perspective of a man who has clearly been undergoing a massive surgical operation. The woman who awakens this man calls him Henry, our titular protagonist. She informs him that he cannot speak as of yet, but that this will be rectified shortly. Now, Henry has no memories of his life or how he got here, which will also be important later. For now, though, Henry has a robotic lower arm and a lower leg attached to replace his missing limbs, and we can see that their potential in some ways outstrips our biological ones, as Henry is capable of easily crushing an apple in his grasp. While his leg is being attached, the woman gives her name as Estelle and informs Henry that the two of them are married, which of course he cannot recall, given his inability to remember any of his previous life before waking up just moments ago. That would probably come off as a bit of a shock, I think. Imagine being woken up and told, "Oh yeah, we're married, by the way," even though you don't have any recollection of who I am or our time together. Estelle then takes Henry into the next room, where another pair of scientists were seemingly goofing off, with one even playing a guitar. The level of noise cancellation between rooms must be astounding here, given that the noise couldn't be heard one room over. I wish I had that. The two men begin to show Henry the selection of voices that he'll be able to choose from, but an automated voice over the PA system announces that there has been a security breach, and the lights change to an alternating blue and red. One of the scientists asks if this is a drill before moving to lock the door, but it's then blasted off its hinges and strikes him, presumably ending his life, as he doesn't move afterwards. I guess this man really did let the door hit him on his way out. Several armed men then burst into the room, holding Henry, Estelle, and the remaining scientist at gunpoint. Another man then enters, looking distinctly different from the troopers, immediately letting us know that he's the one in charge. He then moves to examine Henry and informs him that even though Estelle rebuilt him, that he was the one who supplied her. He also implies that he did extracurricular activities with her, and Henry's vision glitches, letting us know that he also relies on tech to be able to see, or at least to let his brain process what he's seeing. The intruder then commands that the remaining scientist describe what Henry looked like when he was brought in, which also informs us that Henry was very clearly either dead or just short of being dead. All this happens while the man in charge plays with a butterfly knife in preparation for something rather strange to happen. As the scientist finishes describing Henry's injuries, the intruder then demonstrates his apparent telekinetic ability, yanking him off his feet and stabbing him several times before throwing him into the chair that Henry had been sitting in moments earlier. That's a bit out of left field, but we'll roll with it. The villain of our story is then shown to be bleeding from his nose, indicating that using this ability taxes him. Whether this telekinetic ability is derived from a biological, technological, or even magical means is never explained, but given that we see some impressive feats of tech in this movie, I'm inclined to believe that it's some kind of implant that gives him this power. As he tries to stop the bleeding, Estelle hurriedly activates the program on the late scientist's laptop, causing the recorded guitar to blast over the subwoofers at an intensity strong enough to momentarily knock the intruders off their feet. Even Henry, with his tech-augmented senses, is briefly stunned by this. He and Estelle then make their escape, retreating back through the previous room and crawling beneath the grating on the floor. Now, I'm no architectural engineer, but do grates like that typically go anywhere? They then exit the crawl space into a room kept at freezing temperature with corpses in bunks along either side. Estelle then informs us that the villain, known as Aan, wants to use these men brought back from the dead and augmented with tech as his own army. Note that she says, "Men like these we brought back from the dead." This means that if Henry was in the same state as these men, then he too was dead and has been resuscitated. Though this does call into question why Aan would casually kill two of the scientists working on this tech. You'd want them alive to keep overseeing it. Henry then tries to escape through a door clearly marked as an emergency exit, only to find that they are thousands of feet in the air. Let me first say that so far the movie has been entertaining, but I have several questions. How do you have the resources to keep this airship? Why would you have this in an airship at all instead of a cheaper facility on the ground? How did Aan breach and board this ship without severely damaging it? How does this negotiate the airspace of other vehicle paths? I'm not trying to insult the movie here, as it's mostly meant for fun, but I have so many questions already. Henry and Estelle then make their way to where the escape pods are docked, and Estelle informs Henry that there are two. Why are there only two? On a craft this large and with a staff of more than two, why are there only a pair of pods? But another scientist, that we never met and will never see again, just blatantly takes one of the drop pods while Estelle tries to get him to stop. What, so he can die instead? Seems a bit unfair. I mean, the guy is a scumbag with how he spoke to you, but that's a bit much. The two then hear Aan shouting for Estelle, and she tries to get Henry to take the pod himself, but he beckons for her to get in with him. She complies, and the pod begins to drop to the earth. A pod like this would already have enough issues with keeping one person alive, but a second unsecured person should realistically render it unable to keep either of them alive. Yes, I know I'm mentioning realism in a movie that does not prioritize that, but many other aspects of this work and others are fairly grounded. That's the point of an analysis. The two admire the scenery for several seconds before realizing that the ground is getting much too close. Henry pulls the chute manually, which you would think would be an automated process, but the pod slams down onto the highway hard. This is why you should have activated it long ago. Henry is thrown from the pod, relatively unharmed, likely due to his upgrades. He hurries to a motionless Estelle, trying to get her away, but a pair of black and red vans bar their path, and as Estelle comes to, she can tell that they belong to Aan's forces. How did these guys get here so quickly? If the airship was in motion, then trying to pin down where Henry and Estelle landed would take some time. Even if it wasn't, why were these guys at this specific spot? As they approach, Estelle tells Henry that they underestimate him, and that he should wait for them to get close before engaging. As their leader gets in his face, Estelle shouts for him to engage, and Henry punches the man without hesitation. This is already subtly showing us that things aren't as they seem. We'll see more of that towards the end of the film. Henry is quickly overwhelmed by the troopers though, and their angered leader then tases him, and Henry falls from the overpass, landing on a parked car below. Henry quickly rips the taser cords out of his torso and hides amongst the parked cars, but still more of Akan's forces show up to confront a lot worker, swiftly killing him. So Akan's influence must be massive. He can provide an airship, fund scientists to resurrect and augment dead men, and has numerous troops under his command, who seem to be able to get away with blatant murder, showing that Akan is probably paying off someone in power to ignore them. Henry then tries to hide inside a shipping container, but accidentally makes a great deal of noise getting inside, alerting Akan's troops to his presence. A car was stored inside this container though, and Henry breaks off one of its windshield wipers before stabbing the first attacker who enters the container with it. Corners are a dangerous thing when you're armed with a gun. It can potentially let someone get the jump on you and get in too close if you don't approach it properly, which this guy failed to do. Henry used the corner to conceal his presence and attack him in melee, taking his rifle afterwards. The other troopers begin to fire blindly into the shipping container, and Henry saves himself by throwing himself onto his back, seeing as they're firing for where center mass would most likely be on someone who's standing. Henry retaliates by rigging the car to start, where it blasts through the doors, forcing several troopers to throw themselves out of the way to avoid being run over. This buys him enough time to get amongst the parked cars while they're distracted. Granted, their bullets probably wouldn't be stopped by the cars, as the top of a car is largely empty space where those inside are meant to sit, but it would break up his silhouette and make it more difficult for Akan's troops to get a line of sight on him. One enemy attempts to use the same tactic that Henry did just a moment ago, and tries to ram him with a car. Henry runs up to another shipping container though, and is able to leap high enough so that he is unscathed as the car plows into it. His moment of victory is short-lived though, as another vehicle collides with the one Akan's troopers in, sending him flying again. Its occupant blasts Akan's man with a shotgun before drawing a pistol and dispatching two more hostiles before turning his attention to Henry. The man briefly points the pistol at Henry before lowering his weapon, claiming that he isn't here to hurt Henry, and asking if his speech module is installed. Immediately, this lets us know that this man is aware of Henry's situation, along with who Akan is. The two then get into the stranger's vehicle and depart. The man then instructs Henry how to check the power level of the battery keeping him alive, with two quick humorous elements of how Henry needs to untangle the massive wires on the device, as well as the man asking how being married is working out for him. A side point, I swear wires are sentient. You can put untangled wires in a drawer, and when you need to go get them, they'll be in a knot. But as it turns out, Henry has about 20 to 30 minutes before his battery runs out and he dies. The man insists that he, Uncle Jimmy, can help him out, but the two are interrupted by the police lights in the rearview mirror. But even the cops are apparently under Akan's authority, as one draws his sidearm and tries to kill Henry, only stopped by Jimmy shoving it out of the way. They take off down the road, with the corrupt cops shooting at them as they do so, but Jimmy is shot in the process. Henry takes off with the bag of clothes that Jimmy had been about to give him, with the cops in chase. All the while, his vision flickers, a sign of his battery running out of power. Henry quickly takes cover in a small shop inside the subway to change clothes, and takes out a pair of cops along the way. This does show us that he's becoming more competent as time passes, likely from the programming taking effect. In the first encounter, he got off one punch before being subdued. While he struggles against the pair of cops here, he puts up a much better showing, and manages to come out on top. He even demonstrates an instance of parkour or freerunning, as a pair of women with strollers are blocking his way, and he leaps up the walls of the ramp to escape. Side note, these women are incredibly inconsiderate. People don't block the whole walkway. Walk in single file and show some thought for those around you, for crying out loud. Henry then hides inside a passing bus to make good on his escape, but is then confronted by a man that looks very much like he is either homeless or a drunk that doesn't care about his appearance in the slightest. The man then extracts a pair of pliers from his coat and tries to grab Henry's arm, only for him to remove his sunglasses and reveal that he looks exactly like Jimmy, who had just been shot in the car, and claims to be him as well. How he's alive and appears so different is another matter that we'll get into later, but Jimmy rips a component out of Henry's mechanical arm and informs him that this is what was broadcasting his location to Akan's troops. Jimmy then tells Henry that a man by the moniker of Slick Dimitri is Akan's connection, who keeps the authorities under Akan's control and supplies his troops with weapons. Jimmy then gives Henry a phone with a waypoint to Dimitri's base, and tells him that Dimitri himself runs off a battery like Henry does, and that if he can kill him and take it, then he can use it instead. Their conversation is cut short, however, when Jimmy insults a man while the bus is stopped. As it would happen to be, this is another of Akan's troops, who is wielding a flamethrower, which he doesn't hesitate to use. Henry breaks through one of the bus's windows to escape, but Jimmy succumbs to the flames, claiming oddly that he'll be in touch as he dies and drops a pistol, which Henry hastily retrieves. Unfortunately, the flamethrower trooper's jacket is impervious to the rounds Henry fires at him, forcing Henry to flee. But flamethrowers are heavy, making chasing a retreating target dubious. Henry quickly outpaces his attacker and steals some clothes from some goons to further add to his disguise. He eventually makes it to Dimitri's base, but Akan's people are outside. There's a tense moment where one orders Henry to approach, and for a split second the audience is meant to believe that he's been caught. But the trooper simply demands a light for his cigarette before taking the lighter. Henry does have the presence of mind to keep his left hand in his pocket, as it's the robotic arm and its mechanical knuckles have been exposed, whereas his right arm is still biological. Henry then manages to clamber up the side of a building to access a window 4 stories up to get inside. It's quite impressive and was done practically. Seriously, if big-name actors are going to make as much money as they do, this is what should be happening, not them playing around in a green room. Now, I'm not saying that things should be done this hazardously, but practical effects and real stunts turn out so much better than something that's obviously CGI, which has unfortunately become a crutch in most movies these days. Henry then attempts to stealthily make his way through the building, but is discovered when a trio of Dimitri's men are in the elevator he tries to take. This prompts him to kill 2 and grab the third's nose with the pliers that Jimmy gave him. Henry uses the man as a shield while taking out the rest of Dimitri's men, but the last one does shoot the man, though it wasn't enough to take Henry down. This reminds me of the control aspect of martial arts, where you're trying to subdue someone rather than actually harm them. If Henry had simply broken the man's nose, he would have had little incentive to not fight back as hard as he could, seeing as his nose would already be broken. It's the threat of it breaking and pain that keeps someone from resisting. I would also like to mention that Henry is becoming steadily more competent. When he was first awoken, he wasn't much of a match for normal troopers and had to flee most of the time. Now he's infiltrating and behaving much more tactically. Likely, this is part of the programming put into his brain, but we'll get there when the time comes. Henry then takes the keycard and pistol from one of the slain security guards, killing another latecomer in the process. After advancing down a short hall and past a set of servers, he encounters Dimitri himself, though the man is completely unresponsive, even when he's been knocked over. Also note how Henry even checks the corners properly, unlike the trooper in the shipping container. But a garbled message from Estelle distracts Henry, and Dimitri is on his feet. Now, how and why would Estelle be contacting Dimitri? Henry doesn't have time to think about that, but we do, and the implications are not good for our protagonist. Henry is knocked off his feet, and Dimitri retrieves a shotgun. Henry is only saved by yanking on the cords that run from floor to ceiling, which send a shower of sparks onto Dimitri, distracting him for long enough for Henry to get out of the room. Though Dimitri was quite slow on the draw. If he had been quicker, Henry would be dead. Dimitri also takes several seconds to line up his next shot, which, thankfully for Henry, misses. Henry backs into the hall, but Dimitri managed to get into the server room and blind fires around the corner, nearly hitting Henry. Henry returns fire as he retreats, and Dimitri blind fires again, getting closer to hitting his mark. Another of Dimitri's men tries to stop Henry, but is quickly taken care of. But Dimitri has discarded his weapon and fled through the window, forcing Henry to give chase, even jumping from the side of the building with his fall only slightly slowed by a rope. He also lands in a dumpster, and I'm reminded of Dying Light, where you fall massive distances into trash piles where apparently hard objects and glass are never located. The pair then partake in a lengthy chase, showing off more flashy parkour moves, which is very interesting to see from the first person. I know I'll never attempt these stunts. Eventually, Henry takes Dimitri down by throwing a glass bottle at him, which causes him to stumble into a sign and fall. Dimitri tries to fight back, but Henry is much more competent now, and quickly subdues him. Dimitri then tries to get him to wait, saying that he can tell him more about Jimmy, but he is shot by an unseen assailant, with his head exploding and forcing Henry to take cover. Henry hurriedly drags Dimitri's body behind cover and hastily removes his power supply before making his getaway. Shortly thereafter, he receives a call from Jimmy, whom he has seen die twice now. Seem odd? Well, that will be revealed in time. Jimmy provides him with his location, which is an adult establishment that I'm going to have to censor. He's been partaking in copious amounts of substances and other activities. Yes, I have to be very careful with my word choice here. And as he struggles to form sentences, Henry's vision glitches and he falls to the ground. Jimmy panics and claims that he's in no condition to change Henry's power source with Dimitri's and retreats. And Henry begins to recall memories of Estelle and himself partaking in similar activities. But another version of Jimmy, this one appearing much more meek and unsure of himself, enters the room and performs the procedure on Henry while informing him that he's also been wronged by Akan. As if on cue though, the phone rings and the meek Jimmy declares that they're here and runs off in fear. After he leaves, the rambunctious version of Jimmy reawakens and declares that he's going to hold off Akan's troops, telling Henry that there are more weapons in the drawer. A shootout then follows, with Henry partaking in some good old-fashioned dual-wielding. Have to love that. Again, Henry's level of aptitude is rising with each encounter. It's a great way of showing us that the programming put into him is taking effect, rather than telling us. Two women arrive on the scene, however, and while certainly not on the best terms with Jimmy, they seem to be on the same side. Jimmy also exclaims, "The floor is f***ing lava!" while holding a Molotov, and that was a meme in my group of friends for quite some time. Jimmy does try to run from them, and we learn their names are Olga and Katya. Henry continues making his way through the establishment until he finds himself face to face with Akan himself. Akan keeps Henry at bay via his telekinetic abilities, taunting him before throwing him through a vent, shortly followed by Jimmy's corpse. Why Akan let Henry live here, I can't say. His telekinesis has been shown to be unstoppable up until now, though we did see him bleeding from the mouth after using it so intensely. But Henry finds that there is yet another Jimmy who has killed one of Akan's troops and heavily wounded another, and in an amusing bit, gets him to tell the pair that he's taking Estelle to his base, wherever that may be. This likely means more to Jimmy than it does to us or Henry. But the man is killed by Olga and Katya, who break out into an argument with Jimmy. It was a nice creative touch how they used the subtitles to cover up each other's dialogue during the argument. That got a chuckle out of me. Regardless, whatever they were fighting about, the group then take off in motorcycles, with Henry getting to ride in the sidecar with a mounted minigun. The group then comes up behind a convoy of Akan's troops, and the rear van is completely destroyed by Henry. The second van meets a similar fate, but one of the troopers manages to grab a hold of the minigun, causing Henry to lose it. Such a shame. More bullets means more better. Henry then leaps atop the third van, and Jimmy throws him a grenade, though his motorcycle is damaged as he does so, causing him to fall away from the action. Henry tosses the grenade into the open sunroof of the van, causing it to explode and send him flying, but thankfully he's saved by one of the women. I couldn't tell whether it was Olga or Katya, but this just leaves one van and the large truck in the front. A rocket is fired from the van, but fortunately it misses the motorcycle. Henry draws the woman's pistol and fires on the van, but it rams the motorcycle, leaving him hanging on for dear life on the back of the lead truck. In the sequence that follows, the van attempts to kill Henry by ramming the truck, but he's able to kick the steering wheel through a hole in the windshield, causing it to veer off and collide with an oncoming car. Keep in mind that most of these sequences were done practically. Regardless of the writing flaws, I have to give massive amounts of respect for that level of dedication to the craft. Oh, CG was definitely used on this film, but it wasn't just a bunch of actors in a studio room. These guys were out there doing it the hard way, and the results speak for themselves. Most of the sequences in this movie look so much better than anything done almost exclusively in CG. Henry breaks into the leading vehicle by smashing through its air conditioning fan, and the two technicians inside are no match for him. But here we behold Estelle put inside a cell. Henry breaks her out, but their moment is interrupted by Akan contacting them through the truck's onboard systems. Shortly thereafter, he blows a hole in the side of the truck, and Henry momentarily loses consciousness. As he struggles to come to, the officer from earlier arrives with Akan, and Henry is beaten down before he can recover. Akan then threatens Estelle, but Henry manages to convey, non-verbally, that he would rather die in her place. Akan is only too happy to oblige, and strikes him with a baseball bat as he stands in front of the hole in the truck. We get another brief cut of the children from the beginning smashing the toy, letting us know that this is a memory of Henry's. As he regains his vision, one of his eyes has come out of its socket, and we get to see both perspectives at once. It's a neat effect that I never would have thought of, but it does help provide immersion. He's about to be buried alive by Akan's men, but Jimmy has caught up with the woman who hasn't turned into a red smear on the road, and patches Henry up, though he will require a reboot. As he comes to, Jimmy tries to make sure that his vision is working properly, but the sound of something falling towards them cuts him off, and a moment later, the ground he's standing on explodes, killing him and sending shrapnel into the remaining woman. Seriously, I never did find out which one was Olga and which one was Katya. They both died very quickly. Henry, having no weapons on him, takes the woman's sword and runs for it, but he soon discovers that the explosions were created by a tank of all things. As much as I love swords, a katana is no match for a vehicle like this, so Henry is forced to run for his life. The tank fires a shell at him, which misses and sends him flying, which probably should have killed him, but it is what it is. He lands high up in a tree, and the tank tries to dislodge him by ramming it, but Henry drops down onto the vehicle instead. He thrusts his blade through a viewport, and the blood splatter, combined with the pained exclamation from whoever was inside, indicate that they're either dead or in no condition to operate the vehicle. This brings the tank to a stop, and the gunner opens the hatch, attempting to engage Henry with a handgun. Henry is the quicker one though, and kicks the man's hand, causing him to drop the pistol before Henry slashes him and enters the vehicle. One of the tank crew tries to shoot him, even firing once, but Henry manages to gain the upper hand and cuts him open as well. Firing a pistol inside such confines would absolutely wreck your ears. The sound waves would have nowhere to disperse. I actually wrote a paper in college about how game developers will often record sounds outside and inside because of how the sound waves travel, but my professor was an idiot and said that they didn't sound any different. Yeah, I lost points for that. That guy had absolutely no idea what he was talking about, but Akan's not done yet, and a helicopter swoops in, trying to deploy troops. Henry opens fire on the repelling men with his newly acquired pistol, and as the helicopter tries to leave the scene, he grabs a hold of one of the ropes. As he climbs, however, the officer from before appears at the back of the troop bay with a kukri, cutting the rope and sending Henry hurtling towards the earth. Yes, Henry was unconscious for 15 to 20 minutes, but it seems rather quick for this guy to have gotten from the truck to this helicopter. Henry aims for a pond as he falls, and you think he's going to land in the water, but he overshoots and goes directly into a tree. Miraculously, he's not severely injured, which I'll chalk up to his upgrades. As he's done several times already though, Jimmy contacts him once again, providing him with his location. Henry tries, unsuccessfully, to mount a nearby horse, and is very lucky that it didn't decide to kick him. Horses are incredibly intelligent, and won't just let any random person on their backs. In keeping with this, the beast throws him off immediately. So Henry's stuck hoofing it instead of the horse. After a hike through the woods, he eventually reaches the area that Jimmy marked for him and sits down on a stump to have a rest. Surprising him though, a sniper in a ghillie suit rises from the brush and reveals himself to be Jimmy. Some people question how effective ghillie suits can be, but a well-made one is crafted by an experienced soldier and utilizes pieces of the environment that mission will take place in. If they're stationary and in a good position, they can be incredibly difficult to spot. Jimmy then leads Henry to an abandoned structure, but inside, more corrupt cops have abducted a woman in order to perform some heinous actions here. Jimmy demands that Henry leaves them alone so that no attention is drawn to his hideout, but Henry can't bring himself to do it. Henry beats two of them senseless and kills the third. It's a great moment where we get to see who Henry really is as a person. Most of the events have been him fighting for his life without a choice in the matter. Here, he fights because it's the right thing to do. We also get a bit more about Jimmy here. He mentioned that he has a lab set up somewhere in here, and he doesn't want Henry to draw attention to this location. After all, dead cops will raise questions. He does kill the other two cops though, as Henry had already revealed their presence. I'm not much of a gun guy, nothing against them, I just don't find them interesting, but Jimmy's rifle should probably be making way more noise than it does here. Feel free to correct me if there's something I'm not aware of, but suppressors do not make a gun silent. Behind a fake wall though, we behold Jimmy's living space. It's not a bad setup by any means. Beyond that, we find his lab that he mentioned, and we finally get some answers. Jimmy used to work for Akan, and was instrumental in developing the tech that Henry and these other men run off of. However, their early iterations lacked much of their cognitive functions and simply pummeled things mindlessly. Akan was unsatisfied and left Jimmy at their mercy, breaking his back in the process. After this, Jimmy continued his work on tech, resulting in a breakthrough. Railing against his injury, Jimmy created clones of himself that lack any ability to function on their own. Instead, he can pilot them one at a time, living through them to make up for his lack of ability. This is how we saw him die multiple times and still reappear. Strangely though, each of these clones has a drastically different personality. Jimmy describes it as exploring new aspects of myself. Fair enough to some extent, but it's still Jimmy controlling each one. Some are wildly out of left field, like the old-timey military officer. There's no real reason for a few of them to be so eccentric. Unfortunately for the two of them though, Jimmy's tech picks up that Henry is inadvertently broadcasting his location to Akan's forces, and Jimmy panics. He accuses Henry of doing this deliberately, which doesn't make much sense, as he's been with Henry for most of his adventure, and would know that Henry isn't fully aware of what he is anymore. A fight ensues, and Henry nearly comes out on top, until Jimmy's security systems pick up that several vans worth of Akan's troops have passed their perimeter. The two reach a truce, deciding to go after Akan himself. Henry wants Estelle, and Jimmy wants revenge on Akan and his tech. They set explosives on the lab walls and arm themselves, Jimmy controlling the sniper. Jimmy informs Henry that there were 6 vans approaching, and that means that there should be around 35 men approaching. Quite the odds for the pair, but utilizing the terrain and sound strategies have let heavily outnumbered forces come out on top in history. Using sniper rifles, Henry and Jimmy drop several of the intruders, with Jimmy even switching to his hooligan body to engage the attackers in close quarters, confusing them by having to deal with Henry's sniping and a maniac running at them with a blade and a sawed-off shotgun. Hooligan Jimmy destroys one of the vans in an explosion as he's about to be overwhelmed though, taking a few more troopers with him. Sniper Jimmy then reports that they've made it into the building, and thus they won't be needing this particular persona anymore, and Henry should grab a different gun. He then arms a pair of grenades and leaps from the rooftop. Henry grabs several guns, while the Colonel version of Jimmy wheels his real body onto the lift along with his inert dweeb body. What follows is a thrill ride of a shootout, where Henry utilizes a shotgun, a submachine gun, grenades, and no small amount of parkour to fend off the invaders. It just serves to show the amount of effort that went into this film, which had less of a budget than a single episode of TV shows these days. They pull off some incredible feats and visuals here, and it's easily worth watching for this sequence alone if you're a fan of action. This also demonstrates how much more competent Henry has become. In his first fight, he was easily overwhelmed by 2 guys. Now, the combat programming has been incorporated into himself, and he's taking down dozens of opponents. His body language even communicates to us just how much more confident he is, acting without hesitation, whereas before he was very indecisive and confused. As they reach the ground floor and try to wheel Jimmy's real body away, they are confronted at gunpoint by the remaining troopers, led by the officer. Jimmy's had a plan for this though, and detonates the explosives they planted earlier, showering Akan's troops in debris. It's a bit lucky that none of that landed on the 2 of them, but it's not entirely out of the question, so I've got no grievances there. This is also how the officer meets his end, which is slightly anticlimactic, as he'd been more of a personal enemy for Henry. Also, why didn't these guys just shoot Henry and Jimmy? That's what they've been trying to do for the past several minutes, but here they just don't. Not sure what's up with that. Henry and Jimmy then steal one of Akan's vans, heading back through town and dealing with another 3 vans, first with C4, followed by a hail of gunfire, then destroying the 3rd with a rocket launcher. It's a quick sequence, but entertaining nonetheless. How these guys found them, though, I can't say. They then make their way to Akan's base, a towering corporate building, and find it unlocked, along with more potential soldiers in the form of dead men in body bags in the atrium. The flamethrower trooper from earlier makes his reappearance, but Henry manages to grapple him to deny him the use of his weapon, while Jimmy deals with more troopers. Flamethrower Dude makes what's known as a tactical error though, and tries to taunt Henry instead of finishing him off, which gives Henry plenty of time to smash a brick into his head multiple times, killing him. Reinforcements arrive though, and Henry picks up a riot shield to cover Jimmy as they make their way to the elevator. In reality, these do not stop bullets. Henry would be dead here. Dweeb Jimmy grabs a fire axe and tries to buy them a few moments, but he's cut down before he can close the distance, rendering him moot. The 2 do manage to get onto the elevator though, and begin riding it all the way to the top, where Akan presumably is. But the real Jimmy took a shard of glass through the throat during the fight, and thus is going to die. You probably should have stashed him somewhere discreet beforehand to avoid this very thing. Knowing his time is running out, Jimmy uses a device he took from his lab, shining a light into Henry's eye. He tells him that Henry's memories of his previous life are being blocked, and this will disable the inhibitor. He then releases control over Colonel Jimmy, and says his final goodbyes to Henry. Really, Jimmy was such a creative concept that I get a kick out of him every time I watch this movie. More enemies await Henry at the top of the elevator, though they are swiftly dealt with via grenade launcher. This is one of the few shots where the CGI is very noticeable. I don't fault the film too much for it, given their shoestring budget, but it does look pretty fake in this sequence. Moving through the facility, Henry is confronted with a video message from Akan, showing him that everything he's experienced has just been uploaded into his first wave of soldiers brought back from the dead, just as Henry was. What's more, they all will also believe that Estelle is their wife, just as Henry does. Akan then makes an appearance in person, swatting aside Henry's weapon with his telekinesis. Really, that ability is just a bit overpowered, don't you think? Akan then sicks a super soldier on Henry, and for a moment, this one gives him a serious amount of trouble. But his movements are stiff and telegraphed, and Henry is able to get the situation under control and dispose of him. Keep in mind that Henry has had almost an entire day to adjust to the enhanced programming and put it into practice. These new soldiers haven't. There's a big difference between knowing how to do something and having practiced it. I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. Bruce Lee said that, and he's right. Don't practice something until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. That was only the beginning though, as roughly a dozen more cyber soldiers began attempting to break into the room, and Henry rips out the power cell from his recently slain foe, and swaps out his partially depleted one for it, energizing him before retreating onto the rooftop after Akan. But Akan once again swats Henry aside with telekinesis, and now Henry is confronted by dozens of cyber soldiers. Thankfully, none of them are armed, and they only approach him one at a time, letting him beat them down. Despite Akan's speech, these guys seem to be far more fragile than Henry, being dropped by far less damage than he withstood throughout this film. I get that it's probably for the spectacle of it, but Akan was hyping these guys up to be much stronger than Henry, but by all accounts, that was untrue. Even with these shortcomings, it's still quite entertaining to see Henry having to get more and more creative to deal with the onrush of assailants. I'm fully aware of the flaws of this scene, but I'm willing to simply acknowledge them and enjoy the fight. Eventually, Akan gets involved himself though, and Henry is powerless against his telekinesis. Henry is struck insensate, and we can hear Estelle's voice calling out. But not for him. It's then revealed that Estelle was never Henry's wife, but was Akan's all along. So this whole thing was an experiment. This is where the plot really falls apart. Why let Henry, the first unit of yours, go rogue? He slaughtered your first wave of soldiers and cost you immense damage to both personnel and resources. It's a terrible plan. But as Akan kicks Henry, we get to see the man from the first scene again, and as it so happens, this is presumably Henry's father. Henry's memories are returning, and his father tells him that the slur he used is what his father would always call him, and that he wants better for Henry. Child Henry had been beaten up by the three boys, and Henry's father asks him if he's going to just sit there and swallow his own blood, or get up and go spill theirs. Honestly, that's a good bit of advice. It reminds me of when I was a kid. The school system never cared about when one kid was being bullied, but the second myself or another kid fought back, they were the ones in trouble. The lesson to be learned is that you always need to be prepared to fend for yourself. Sign your kids up for martial arts classes. Better to know how to defend yourself and not need it, than to need it and not know how. Henry gets back to his feet, and manages to catch Akan by surprise and grabs a hold of his arm as he tries to throw Henry again, thus launching himself as well. Akan then just sort of levitates in the air, which really should be injuring him significantly, seeing as much less than this has made him bleed quite a bit. Henry manages to leap up to him, and in a display of sheer gumption, pulls out his mechanical eye and uses its cord to cut off the top of Akan's head. Points for creativity there. We even get the same two-perspective trick from before. The rest of Akan's body is shredded by the helicopter rotors as Estelle flees, and I'm not entirely sure how Henry managed to miss them himself. He does manage to leap aboard as it takes off, and Estelle proceeds to shoot him several times once she sees Akan's severed head. She demands to know how Henry could have done such a thing, but really? You're surprised he fought back? I know that it's probably an emotional response, but come on. Henry responds to her by writing "easy" in blood like this is a post-match Dead by Daylight lobby. Estelle then tries to shoot him again, but the bullet ricochets off Henry's mechanical hand, striking her instead. She staggers a few steps away, then falls from the open door of the helicopter, barely hanging on by her fingertips. She pleads with Henry to save her, attempting to use the programming of him believing that she loves him, but Henry has moved on from that. Instead, he slams the door down on her fingers, causing her to plummet to her death, and thus the film ends. So that was Hardcore Henry. As for scoring, objectively, I'd give it a 5. The entire plot of Henry going rogue was nonsensical, and there are numerous aspects that can be called into question. Enemies seem to teleport into scenes as they're needed, and many matters are unexplained, like the telekinesis and sheer amount of resources needed for this to happen. But subjectively, I'm giving this a 6. Now, that might sound low, but I'm not a review site that has its ratings bought out. Most media tends to get a 5 or lower from me in terms of subjectivity. 6 is still quite enjoyable. If you like action, then this is a great ride. Some of the acting was a bit off, like Estelle's at the end, and I wish Akan was a little less juvenile, and the movie sort of just stops rather than ends. But it's still a very fun movie to watch, especially with friends. And that's not even taking into account the sheer amount of effort and passion put into this, which is all made with a minuscule budget for a film. Check this movie out if you get the chance and are looking for a thrill. I would like to thank you for sticking around this long. If you've seen this movie, what did you think about it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, leave a like on this video if you're so inclined, and subscribe to see more. And may you all have a weapon in each hand.